Welcome to the Wild Ag Podcast, where we'll serve as a connection point for landowners and conservation professionals who want to integrate conservation and agriculture. I'm Dr. Andrew Little, Professor of Landscape Ecology and Habitat Management and Extension Specialist at the University of Nebraska.
And I'm Nate Pfluger, Precision Ag Coordinator for Pheasants Forever and an avid outdoorsman with friends and family in my free time. Together, we'll work to bring you perspectives from both landowners and conservation professionals for discussions on soil, water, and wildlife in ag-dominated landscapes.
All right, welcome back to the Wild Ag Podcast. Our co-hosts here, Nathan Pfluger and myself. Today we have the fortunate opportunity to have Dr. Mike Chamberlain, National Wild Turkey Federation Distinguished Professor at the University of Georgia with us. Mike, thanks for joining us, and we're going to talk a little bit about the state of wild turkeys. So go ahead and introduce yourself and give us a little bit of background.
Well, it's good to be with you guys. So I'm Mike Chamberlain. I'm a researcher and outreach faculty member at the University of Georgia. I basically get paid to conduct research, applied field-based research, and then to explain what it means to people, whether it be academics, landowners, stakeholders of natural resources, state and federal agencies, et cetera. I've been here at the University of Georgia for about 13 years now. Having spent a little more than a decade in Baton Rouge, where I worked at Louisiana State University. So, kind of long in the tooth when it comes to academics.
That's good. Well, so give me a little bit of background on kind of what led you to work with wild turkeys as a career. Obviously, I'm sure hunting played into that, but just kind of curious, kind of what led to your career where you're really well known in that arena.
Yeah, honestly, I kind of fell into it, Andy, as you may know. I grew up turkey hunting, but we hunted in the fall, and our turkey hunting season was very short, but I really enjoyed it. And so when it was time to go to college, I went to Virginia Tech, and about the beginning of my senior year, I realized that when I was doing job searches, the salaries for entry-level wildlife biologists were pretty low. So I said, well, let me go to graduate school if I can get in. And I was fortunate enough to be offered 3 positions at Mississippi State. And the reason I was offered 3 was because I was the top candidate that applied to this particular professor. And he said, I'll let you choose. And so one project was on wood ducks, which are interesting. One project was on squirrels, which wasn't very sexy. And the third project was on wild turkeys. And he explained kind of the meat of the project, which was a capture and radio telemetry study. And I just thought, well, wow, what a great way to spend time in graduate school. And that was it. I got hooked really quick when I started trapping birds, and it's gone from there. I've been fortunate enough to be able to conduct research on wild turkeys every year since.
That's awesome. That's really cool.
On your initial project that got you into grad school, what were you looking at as far as research as opposed to what you're looking at today? Kind of how has that research shifted?
Interestingly enough, that project in many ways opened my eyes to what is now ongoing in a lot of studies that I'm doing. And that is, this particular population had not been hunted for quite some time. It was very lightly hunted. And it became a wildlife management area. And there was very little known about turkeys in the bottomland type forests where this site occurred. These sites deal with a lot of flooding, and so I started this project in many ways just collecting very baseline data on how turkeys move, how much space use, how much space they use, what habitat types they were selecting, what their reproductive rates were. And interestingly enough, as I started that project, the population had started to decline. And the first year of my study, we had a catastrophic flood in that part of Mississippi. And that was the first year of a longer term study And in that 4 or 5 year time, the population essentially crashed because of spring flooding and a lack of reproductive success. So it kind of opened my eyes in a lot of ways to how this bird is driven by reproductive output. And in the absence of reproduction, their populations can't sustain themselves very long. They start to decline very quickly. And that's what we saw in that project. And now fast forward 25 years and we're seeing very low reproductive output in many of our populations. And ergo, they have declined at various rates.
Well, and that's kind of another question that I wanted to ask. What year was this your initial research when you saw that first crash? Because obviously they must have come back up to some level because, like you just touched on, we're seeing that decline again today.
Mhm. Yeah, so basically the declines in many regions, particularly the southeast and the parts of the east, really started as restoration was ending, which was if I'm much older than you guys, so I can remember the National Wild Turkey Federation and many state agencies had a Target 2000. And that what that was the goal of restoring wild turkeys to all of their former range by the year 2000, and that goal was accomplished. And if you go back and look at the declines and the data showing the declines, they really started very soon after 2000 in many places. And so the decline started, let's say 2003, 2005, 6, 7, 8, in that range. You started seeing a signal that something was amiss. Poult per hen ratios, which is a primary metric that many agencies use as a proxy for productivity. So basically the number of young turkeys that are being produced in the summer. Those ratios had been declining in many areas, but very slowly. So if you looked from one year to the next, you didn't really see a problem. But if you looked across 10 years, you started seeing that there were already ongoing declines. And then around 2011, that's when we started obtaining data from a number of states and crunching the numbers and producing figures that we could disseminate to people. And in 2015, we published a manuscript showing these regional declines across the Southeast. And ironically, that same year, there were other researchers publishing works from other parts of the US showing similar declines. And so it started happening well before 2015, but that's the year that a lot of the publicity started. And then honestly, and this is one of the positive outcomes of the COVID crisis, was that I think everyone being stuck and not being able to see each other and having to communicate via social media and other platforms, that's when I started seeing a lot of discussion about the declines, because people were seeing content that was being published. They were engaging with each other on social media. They were having aha moments. I saw thousands of them on my platforms where people were, I didn't realize that was happening. Things looked pretty good in my neighborhood, but now suddenly they don't. And you started seeing this very organic conversation amongst turkey hunters who were all, and not all, but who many of whom were seeing these problems, not only in their back 40, but in places they were traveling to, et cetera.
That's really interesting. Yeah, and that's good. Kind of jumps into that historical perspective, because I wanted to talk through that and kind of that. So when did the restoration efforts really kind of kick off for turkeys? Dating back into the, obviously before 2000. So what was that kind of start date?
Yes, the restoration started, 1940s, 50s, 60s. The advent of the cannon net or rocking net, where biologists, agency personnel could go and capture birds, wild birds, and translocate them to other parts of the species range and then release them. That's when restoration really kind of kicked off in earnest. The previous efforts using game farm birds had largely been a complete failure. And so it was the advent of the rocket net and the willingness of people like Wayne Bailey and other state biologists who became experts at capturing birds, and they were then willing to travel to other states and train other people on how to capture and move birds. And so as you moved through the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, the restoration effort really ramped up. And then by the 1990s, a lot of states were where they wanted to be. There were still some states that were still involved in restoration, but I think in many ways, if you look back at the heyday of restoration, it was the 80s and 90s, and again that target 2000 was met, and I think many people, including myself, thought things were good. We were good. We could take our foot off the gas and kind of wipe our hands, and everything's good now. We've got turkeys where we wanted them, and their populations are exploding, and meanwhile, there were problems under our noses, and we just didn't see it.
Is there any literature as to why they were extirpated from their historical ranges to begin with?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, turkeys succumbed to many of the same issues that other large species did. As Europeans colonized the continent, a loss of habitat, the conversion of the clear cutting of the eastern forest, over harvest, market hunting, the same things that have affected so many other species basically pushed turkeys to the brink. The only remnant populations were in areas that were very, very difficult to access, that could not be cleared, could not be converted to agricultural, or had, the timber couldn't be harvested efficiently. And so you had some pockets, right, where turkeys persisted, and those were the pockets that became the source of the restoration efforts.
And there's one little thing that I want to touch on that you mentioned, where you said that wild releases had better effects or more positive effects than your game bird or your game ranched turkeys. Is that correct?
Oh, for certain. Yeah. The game farm experiments were a dismal failure. And it's because, those birds do not have the wherewithal to avoid predation. They lack the predator avoidance skills that wild birds have, and they simply didn't persist on the landscape. Whereas if you kind of think about it fundamentally, so you had source populations of turkeys that had persisted despite our efforts as man and womankind to extirpate them, right? I mean, we had tried everything we killed as many as we could, we cleared forest as much as we could, and yet there were still pockets of turkeys. And now you take those pockets of turkeys that have persisted under this persecution and you use them to create new populations. So it's not surprising to me that once restoration really started ramping up, populations exploded because they were being released into vacant habitat, and they had predator avoidance skills. They knew how to forage. They knew how to find safe roost sites. They knew how to survive. And once we started putting them in vacant landscapes that had suitable habitat, their populations skyrocketed.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. To that point, Nathan, I know in the pheasant realm, that's something that's fairly popular, of pen releasing birds. And depending on kind of what you're, I always say, what we've seen from some studies, it's like if you're just doing it because you want to be able to release them to hunt immediately, just release them right at that time or right around that time, as opposed to trying to release them maybe earlier on in the year. I know there's been some work that I've actually been part of in the past where I actually looked at that here in Nebraska. And so releasing them earlier in the year really didn't prove to be very successful. And so most of them died pretty quickly. So.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, with wild turkeys, you do see, as you know, you do see the occasional heritage variety bird that will, domestic bird that will pop up in a wild flock, and
Sure.
And you see that commonly with wild turkeys, where you'll have a domestic bird that is on free range, right, or is allowed to mingle on a farm, and suddenly they become feral and
Sure.
end up in these wild flocks. And that's always something that's really interested me.
Sure. Yeah. And it's always possible that some can make it through. But like you said, I think the predator avoidance is something that, and obviously just the gut and what they're consuming, their microbiome is quite a bit different. And when they're, fed pelletized things versus being out there consuming bugs and other things in the landscape. So,
Yeah. And I get questions still about, well, I'll get messages routinely. Could I just go? My turkeys I don't have any turkeys anymore. The local population is so low. Could I just release, commercial birds? And my response is always the same. No, you're absolutely wasting your time and your effort, and you have potential to spread diseases and create problems. And we've already been down this road before, and it was a complete failure. It required wild birds being captured and relocated.
sure.
Yeah. Remembering the past is important.
Yeah,
So you're
absolutely.
not just remaking mistakes.
Yeah, we're not repeating the past. Yeah.
So, yeah, we kind of touched on the historical aspects of turkey populations. I think most of us know that today we're kind of down in one of those bottoms or troughs with reduced numbers. Can you speak to where we're at today? Maybe not only in Georgia, but across the Midwest?
Yeah, I think what you're seeing in a lot of populations, it really depends on where you are. So, for instance, over the last decade, in many southern states, we've seen populations that have declined to the point where many agencies have made changes to harvest regulations, have changed spring harvest, have altered fall harvest, or have closed fall seasons. And in many cases, it appears that populations have gotten stable, albeit at a very much lower level, right? So here in Georgia, Arkansas, Louisiana, there are a number of states that all have data that look the same, that populations have trended downward and finally were stabilized, harvest kind of stabilized, and now you're seeing some populations that appear to be stable, albeit at lower levels than what we'd want. And then you have others that are trending slightly upward. And then on the flip side, you have states like what you've seen out in your area where populations have trended downward for, 4, 5, 6 years in a row. And then you flip that coin over and you go to places like populations in parts of the Northeast that appear to be doing quite well. And so I think it just speaks to the complexity of how turkey populations function, because you literally have one animal that may be experiencing very different vital rates and population trajectories from one part of the landscape to the other.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, and I can speak to that. I have a number of landowners that I work with, and some they're complaining about turkeys, right? They're getting into the hay yards or their areas, and they're complaining that they have too many turkeys. And then another landowner is saying, "Where'd our turkeys go?" So
Yeah.
I mean, it's even across the board here in Nebraska too.
Yeah, that's true.
And we even see that. I mean, we see that commonly in parts of the South. This year was a great example where you literally have a few counties in certain states that appeared to have a nice increase in reproduction this year. And yet, right across into another county where conditions appeared to be the same, right? Weather was the same, everything was the same. You didn't see those responses. So, and I've said this on many podcasts before, but in many ways, turkeys literally exist in pockets. They're not uniform across the landscape. Now, out in your area, it's startling how they're in pockets, right? Because
Sure.
a lot of the landscape is not turkey habitat. But here in the South, you would just drive around and say, well, turkeys could live everywhere here. But in reality, they don't function like that. They live in pockets. And therefore, some pockets can do quite well certain years, and some pockets don't do as well. And that's kind of the way turkeys function anyway. So when you get years like this down in the South where we literally, it looks like it was literally boom or bust, depending on what part of the landscape you live in. It again, it speaks to how complex these populations are in regards to how they're functioning.
That's interesting. Yeah. So obviously, turkeys have been declining for a variety of reasons. And so, through the research that you guys have been doing in Georgia and many other states, what are some of the primary factors that you talk with landowners about what basically causing these declines? It's usually kind of death by a thousand cuts.
Yeah. Yeah, there's some overarching broader issues for sure. One being, it doesn't matter where you go in the species range, you are seeing a loss of habitat. And habitat's a very broad, ambiguous thing, as you know, but you're seeing a loss of the vegetative, communities that turkeys thrive in, whether it be simply the removal of that habitat, or whether it be a lack of management that sustains that type of habitat, or it could be a conversion of that habitat to something else. And so as I travel around the country and either hunt or do research, I see, you know, dramatic losses in hardwood forest across many parts of the US. I see fragmentation issues where we're taking what's out there and we're putting roads through it, rights of way through it. We are, in many ways, taking a hands-off approach in many parts of the US. And what I mean by that is you see many parcels that are not managed at all in any way. So there's a lack of management. And what that creates through time is vegetative communities that are denser and taller and thicker, and turkeys are unable to use those areas. And so when I say kind of a loss of habitat, I really kind of mean not just a loss, but a degradation of the remaining habitat that's out there. And that's obviously an issue the bird faces. Something that's confounded within that is predation. And all of the things I just discussed, as you know, factor into the risk that a bird is going to encounter, whether it be losing their nest or losing their own life. And it's not surprising that we see very high predation rates on nest, about 80% in many of our populations. And it's tough being an adult turkey as well. I mean, we just finished some work across about 12 study sites showing that females live, about 70% of them live each year.
Hmm.
And so if about 70% live each year, and you have very low reproductive success, right? If you have very low nest success, that the numbers don't add up.
Yeah.
If you're taking 70% of all the reproductively active females out every year, and you're not replacing them at a high rate, then through time the population is going to have to decline. And so those are two, like we talked about before we started recording. There's all these other issues that face turkeys, whether it be disease issues that we don't fully understand. Spring turkey or turkeys are unique in one way, in that most harvest occurs during their breeding season. So you have a bird that is encountering a lot of challenges on the landscape, and they're also being hunted during their breeding season, which is unique for game birds in the lower 48 at least. And so you wrap all that together, and there's I liken it to this. So, habitat and predation and harvest and disease, these things affect turkeys everywhere. But in any given place, there may be other positions on the field, if you will, that are influencing birds that may not be influencing birds 5 or 6 counties away or in the next state. Or, so, for instance, just right now with the landfall of Hurricane Helene, turkey populations in the Apalachicola region of Florida and in southern Georgia are now dealing with what they just dealt with a few years ago when Michael came ashore. And now this catastrophic loss of roosting habitat. And for instance, in places in South Georgia, turkey populations have plummeted. And now suddenly you introduce another natural disaster that augments their habitat. And that, of course, would have no effect on turkey populations a few counties over, but boy, it creates challenges.
Sure. Yeah. No, that's a really good point. And I think that's the take home out of this for people is that ultimately, there's some key factors out there. I would argue habitat loss, like you said, is really that number one driver, especially in states like Nebraska and a lot of Midwest states where we've lost so much habitat over time. And then we get this, as you mentioned, fragmentation. And so people obviously basically move towards this idea of, obviously we're thinking it's more of a predation issue. Well, in reality, it's because we fragmented so many of these places where it's a little bit easier now if you're a raccoon or a coyote or whatever to kind of find these little limited patches because there's not many of them left in the landscape.
Well, and I just think the weather component is huge too, because when we're talking about habitat degradation or loss, I mean, they just get pushed to these areas that more often than not really can't be farmed because they're river bottoms or something like that. So in the spring, when you get heavy floods, as you mentioned before, I mean, that's just another battle that they have to deal with. They're probably losing nests in those areas.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, if you look at turkeys across the species range, precipitation issues are not usually problematic to eastern birds. But as you move out more to the western subspecies, Merriams and Rios and Goulds, you start seeing that precipitation matters, and it's often in the form of droughts, where you see very poor reproduction in drought years. And conversely, when you have wet winters where you come out of winter and it's been nice and wet and spring green up explodes and there's plenty of nesting habitat, there's a lot of insects on the landscape, many of the western subspecies will do quite well during those years. Well, then just look at what's occurred over the past decade in many parts of the Midwest and even beyond. We've seen severe droughts in many areas, and not just 1 year, multi-year droughts that for wild turkeys, that creates a real problem that you don't see in eastern populations really per se, but you definitely see them out west.
Okay. Yeah. So I guess I had that just a little backwards, thinking that more of the flooding was gonna
No,
be
you're right. No, you're right. I mean, some of the catastrophic flooding that you see in the spring is certainly problematic because as you go out in your area, those river corridors and those riparian areas, in many cases, are the only intact habitat that's there, right? And so when you have catastrophic flooding like that, it can be extremely problematic for turkeys, particularly if it's during the spring when they're during the breeding season. But yes, I simply was pointing out that when you think precipitation for turkeys, you often think, like you were saying, flooding. And the flip side of that is when it's extremely dry out west, that's bad. And you see it for all of those western subspecies.
No, that makes sense, which, as you touched on, is what we've dealt with, not particularly this year, but the previous 2 years.
Yeah.
While we're touching on just habitat, what are they looking for when they want nesting habitat? Would they prefer to be in a river bottom, or would they prefer to be up in the uplands in more of a grassland type habitat?
In areas where they have upland environments available to them, they typically will reproduce in more upland areas. In some places of the species range, they don't have that luxury, but even so, for instance, even in true bottomland habitats where changes in elevation may literally be inches, right? Flat, super flat, they will still nest in the more upland areas they have available to them. But that trend becomes much more exacerbated as you go to where you have changes in elevation. So typically what happens is turkeys will winter at lower sites and then move out of those sites into more upland environments to breed. And then from there, the pattern we've seen with turkeys in general, in fact, it's ironic you asked this. I just read this paper this morning. A former student finished this analysis. Not surprisingly, turkeys do tend to select areas to nest in that have enough cover to hide them, that offer enough concealment where she can sit there undetected. But from there, it's all over the map. Literally, it looks like as long as there's enough cover to hide her, or some topographic feature, whether it's a hill or a blowdown, even anything that would allow her to conceal herself. Beyond that, it's all over the map as to what a nest looks like. What an actual nest site looks like. I don't know if I've ever seen two that look the same. They're all very, very different.
Okay. So once they get through the nesting and say they do end up hatching out a brood, does that brood habitat become, I mean, is that all over the board too? Or can you put your finger on that more?
No, that becomes much more specialized, and that's an excellent question because brood habitat is one of the biggest limiting factors I see during my travels is a lack of brood habitat. And what's interesting when you look at brood habitat is it changes a lot from day 1 to say day 20. So the first week and a half, 2 weeks that turkeys after they're hatched, imagine you're a bird that's the length of your hand, right? So you have to be able to move through vegetation. So early brood habitat is open ground, bare ground. You should be able to see the soil, vegetation that a small bird can walk through and navigate through easily. It needs to be low growing enough to where the hen can stand there and observe and see through and over the vegetation. So, and I've used this analogy before. If you want to understand what brood habitat looks like, you need to lay down on your stomach and look at the landscape laying on your stomach, because that's what a 7-day-old poult sees. And so the first couple of weeks, brood habitat is safe, open vegetation, nearby cover to escape into. You don't see hens a lot with very young broods. They're very secretive. She's trying to hide them in plain sight, if you will. But once they get to about 2 weeks old, when they can start roosting above the ground at night, their diet starts to change. They shift to eating seeds and insects rather than just insects. They'll start consuming green plant material. At that point, say around day 20, they're growing exponentially. They literally look different by the day. And at that point, you'll start seeing turkeys in more open areas. And this is often when we start seeing them as landowners and hunters and biologists,
Sure.
just 3 to 6 weeks of age, where they're starting to look like little chickens. And at that point, they will start moving into more open areas. They will use, pastures and fields and places where there's low growing green vegetation. And it's because they can eat different things, and they can avoid predation once they get to that age. So the first couple of weeks is very, very specific, and then it starts to become more fluid, if you will, and they expand what they can use after they're a few weeks old.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we touched on the nesting, we touched on the brood rearing. Can you just briefly describe what that winter habitat looks like? You mentioned that they might be stuck in those lower areas as opposed to the uplands, but can you explain that a little more, please?
Yeah, so once turkeys get to the beginning of fall, they fundamentally change their behavior. They move out of these very small groups that they've been in. They start forming fall flocks. Those flocks will become, as you know, out in your area, quite large in some places. And so you have literally, in some cases, hundreds of birds that are now requiring food, and therefore they are going to spend their fall and winter focused solely on two things, that is surviving and eating. And so hard mast, depending on where you live in North America, hard mast, acorns, beech nuts, things like become critically important. Waste grains become extremely important. In agricultural areas, particularly if livestock are involved, turkeys are going to naturally gravitate toward livestock operations because they can obtain food in those areas. And so they really just kind of become a let's survive each day and consume enough resources to sustain ourselves. That's really what drives them in the winter.
That's really good. Yeah, well, and I can attest a couple of things. One is just those large flocks in the wintertime, because we obviously see that here. And you mentioned about around livestock facilities, very common. That's where, you get landowners are complaining, saying, hey, I got a huge flock of turkeys here. What's going on? How can I, get rid of them on my property? And so that's obviously, you see that quite a bit. And that's actually where we trap around a lot of those places for getting our birds for our study right now. And then two, just seeing the GPS data already, they're, like you mentioned, Mike, they're already starting to flock back up already as they're getting ready to head into the winter time here pretty quick. So,
And it's interesting because out your way, you tend to see birds concentrate around these agricultural operations, and their ranges are quite small, right? They don't
sure.
travel. And on the flip side, I can pull GPS data from a bird in the southeast, and they may use 10,000 acres in a month. And it's because they're not relying on livestock or waste grain.
Sure.
They're solely relying on acorns, on hard mast, and therefore they're competing with everything: white-tailed deer, squirrels, feral pigs, you name it, anything that's going to consume an acorn. And therefore they're having to travel, right, to find pockets. So what they do in many parts of the range is completely the opposite of what you see in your area. They don't hunker down and go back to the same resource constantly. They are on the move. They're almost nomadic, right?
Yeah.
And so their home ranges expand in the winter to try to find resources to sustain them until spring. And the other interesting thing that I think many people probably don't know is that turkeys are supposed to weigh more at the end of winter than at any other time in the year. So unlike many animals that would lose weight during the winter, turkeys are gaining weight.
Sure.
And what they're trying to do is to gear up for reproduction, right? So at the end of the winter, they're supposed to be as fat and happy as they're going to get. And if you think about that fundamentally, that requires the bird to obtain as much energy as possible while burning as less, right? It's an interesting strategy to want to get as fat as you're going to be by the end of the winter, right?
Sure. Yeah, no, and that's a good point, because, and you mentioned about out here, it's like, and seeing some of these sites, you'll go to the farm and they literally, landowners said, well, hey, this group of trees over here is where they'll roost at night, and then they go a couple hundred yards to his feed lot, and then spend a good portion of the day there, and then back out to roost to those trees. But to your point, they're not, going miles and miles and miles around searching. In most cases, they're locking in on those feed lots, and that's where they spend a lot of time at. So
yeah, and we actually see the same pattern across a few days or a week, or in many of our eastern populations. What I mean by that is you'll look at the GPS data and you'll see a flock that obviously encountered a lot of prey. They got into a hardwood bottom and they traveled, and then suddenly they spent 4 or 5 days in the same general area, and then they left. Right. And I can only surmise that what happened is they encountered, an area that had a lot of acorns on the ground. They used those resources as much as possible. And then once they depleted them, they moved on to other areas.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's what I just think the collared bird side of things just gives us an insight that, you wouldn't otherwise think about. So it's just neat to hear what you think's going on when they're moving around the landscape.
Sure.
So.
Yeah.
So you briefly mentioned that for nesting and then brood rearing, turkeys like those more upland acres. So working for Pheasants Forever, obviously they might be interacting with pheasants and quail out there on the landscape in that spring and summer. Is there any data that suggests that turkeys are the reasons or could cause a decline in pheasants and or quail numbers at all? Have you been asked that question?
Oh yes.
Can you speak on that a little bit, please?
Yes, I've been asked. I've been asked my thoughts on, well, could ruffed grouse populations be declining because turkeys are destroying their nest? Could quail populations be declining because turkeys are destroying their nest or eating the chicks or whatever. Could pheasant populations have declined because of these same issues where you're seeing direct competition, right? We call it interference competition, where literally one bird is doing something to the other. And my response is always the same. No, there's no published substantiated data to show support for those claims. And I still hear it. In fact, I know a landowner in your area quite well who will tell me that he has observed turkeys destroying pheasant nests. And I enjoy being around this person. I'm certainly not going to tell him that he's a liar, right? But what I have asked him to do is the next time he sees it to video it, because I would like to see it with my own eyes. But in the absence of that, there's no published information suggesting any relationships such as that.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I get asked a lot as well, and it's something that's been, there is no data out there that I'm aware of that has shown that, as you mentioned. And what I always tell people is go back to those limiting factors, what's causing the declines. And in most cases, that's a loss of habitat. If you can start fixing that big hole that you have in your bucket, that I think that's a good starting point in most cases, especially in these ag-dominated landscapes. So.
For sure.
Kind of looking at these other little things and the potential, it's like that's not likely what's causing your decline in your area. It's in most cases the loss of habitat, and particularly, as you mentioned earlier, the loss of that nesting and brood rearing cover. I think that's one of the big things I see a lot, and I've kind of pondered that question around brood rearing cover. Is you see as we're kind of fragmenting these patches smaller and smaller, we're farming every obviously square inch, and I understand why from an economic side. But ultimately, does that in turn affect those populations where those birds are having to move maybe further distances between nesting and brood rearing cover, and then obviously wintering cover to basically survive essentially in the landscape?
Yeah, and what we have seen, that's a good point that prompts me to say this. We have seen very clearly with our research that a brood on the move is a dead brood. Broods that travel farther distances from the nest site to locate suitable vegetative communities have much lower survival. So what turkeys should do is be able to hatch and then very quickly move to quality brooding cover and hunker down and use those areas. So when they're having to travel to find suitable habitat, that's at the detriment of their own survival. Again, if you ever, this is how fundamentally I kind of look at turkey habitat. Literally, it's quite simple in many ways. Is they have to have a safe place to roost at night, and out in your area, roost sites are usually fairly easy to identify.
Sure.
From there, you want that bird to not have to travel very far at all, ever.
Sure.
Right? So its days
sure.
should be covering very little ground. And if you've got birds that are traveling miles in a day, they will do that and they can do that, but they're not supposed to be doing that. They're supposed to be using smaller areas where they can obtain a lot of resources and not burn energy. And when we're requiring them through whatever our landscapes look like, when we're kind of forcing them to have to move, that's problematic for survival.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, and it also brings up the point of human dimensions work, and I know I've been doing some of that, and kind of speaks to Nathan, to your earlier point, the dynamics. Obviously we're in an ag-dominated state. Ag production is key here, and I wanted to kind of speak a little bit to that, and kind of obviously some producers, or maybe turkeys are not maybe their primary thing that they're wanting to manage for, but obviously economics is a big driver for that decision making for a producer, and so. When you're interacting with landowners, especially in states like Nebraska and other ag-dominated states, what's your message to them when, again, most cases they're basically farming to feed their family, and so turkeys are probably not a big priority. Maybe they do hunt, but again, it's not a number one priority for them. So they're trying to obviously farm every square inch that they can to ensure they can pay off those bills.
Yeah, and I mean that's just the reality of the world we live in, right? I
Sure,
mean, economics drives everything.
sure.
So I deal with that everywhere that I travel that turkeys live. There's always competing demands for space, for resources, for land. And what I typically will try to encourage people to do is to think about the future. What do you want the future landscape to look like? And what I mean by that is you got to understand that turkeys thrive in vegetative communities that a lot of species thrive in. And as you both know, many of those species are in global decline, right? So many species that use early successional habitats like turkeys thrive in are declining. And so at the end of the day, I kind of, if you're interested in turkeys, great. Anything that you're willing to do to better balance what you're accomplishing economically with the future of this bird and the other species that thrive where it does, then that's great. If you're willing to balance, and that's kind of where I ultimately see it being, is a balance. If you're willing economically to sacrifice a little, then do it. And if you're not, well, then that's certainly your call. And
Sure.
but if you are, then just understand that that sacrifice is also benefiting a number of other species on the landscape that are going to impact what our world looks like decades from now.
Sure.
That's kind of the way I look at it, and that's easy for me to say because I'm not the person giving up
Sure.
economically, right?
Sure.
I mean,
Yeah.
so of course it's easy for me to say
Sure.
that, but at the end of the day, I think we're just going to have to try to strike a balance, whether it be agricultural production, whether it be timber production, whatever the competing economic demand is. We're just going to have to try to seek balances.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. That's exactly why we developed the Awesome Lab with that intent. And that's our mission, and that's why we developed this podcast because we want to have those honest conversations about the challenges we face. And to your point, when you're out there, farming to feed and fuel the world, every acre does count, and that's why producers do that. And so ultimately, but to your point, if we can find those balances, I think that's the better for those species, for soil health, for water quality issues, and that's why we do things like prairie strips. We're taking 10% of a corn or soybean field and putting them into perennial vegetation. So it's helping that producer optimize their fields in a way that can benefit different needs that they have, natural resource needs, and ultimately ensure the sustainability of their farms and ranches for future generations, as you mentioned. So.
Yeah, and it could be, out in your area, it may, and I think the word simple would be the wrong word, but that's what's coming to mind. But in some cases, it could be as simple as using the research that's ongoing in many parts of the Midwest to identify areas that are priority for wild turkeys, whether it be these are roost locations that are impacting the population, or these are wintering areas that birds are using, or these are places where birds are reproducing in the spring, whatever the case may be,
Sure.
and to use that research to prioritize parts of the landscape for long-term management and conservation, because our world is continuing to grow and evolve, right? And,
Sure.
and there's going to be increasing demand for every acre of land everywhere. So the future may be simply stepping back and identifying areas where not just turkeys, but again, the vegetative communities that they thrive in is the target. How do we conserve and maintain these vegetative communities through time so that we have this bird and the other species that are adapted to those same communities?
Yeah, it's good.
So you brought up the idea of balance. And when I'm out there on the landscape, quite often, a lot of producers bring up that predators are way out of balance. I mean, the fur market is in the tank. I mean, it's not much of anything currently. Do you guys have any research that shows what you have to do to control predators to see a positive impact on turkeys?
it really depends on the predator community that you have to deal with. And so what I mean by that is if you come, say, to parts of the Southeast, you have predator communities that are extremely rich and diverse. And so you may have species that are taking adults. You may have 3 or 4 species that are killing adults, and you may have 10 species that are eating nests or taking poults. And what research in general has shown is that for predator management to be effective, one, it's most effective when it's paired with habitat improvements and management. 2, it needs to be intensive, meaning repeated, right?
Sure.
And it needs to be extensive, meaning you need to target as many predator species as you can legally. And that's where it gets tricky for turkeys, because in certain parts of the landscape, you're dealing with a lot of different predators, many of which cannot be legally addressed through population management, whether it be birds of prey, snakes. In the South, rat snakes are a huge predator of poults and of nest. Whereas you can go into other areas, where predator communities are more simplified, where you may only be dealing with a handful of species that are impacting turkeys. And if you're intensive and extensive with your predator management, and you're doing this repeatedly every year, as near to the onset of nesting season as possible, then you may see some positive benefits, but you may not as well. And I can give you a number of examples of landowners I've worked with that have put a significant amount of effort into predator management and have seen very modest or any impact whatsoever to their local turkey population. And yet I can take you to other landowners that have done extensive and intensive predator management and have done it annually for many years and have paired that with intensive habitat management, and they've seen very positive responses from that. So I think it really ultimately depends on a lot beyond just, hey, let's go trap some predators, right?
So you mentioned in the South, your predators are birds of prey and snakes. Could you speak a little bit what might be our biggest predators here in Nebraska at their different life stages? Are you familiar with those?
Yeah. So pretty much region or species wide, range wide, there are some critters that impact turkeys everywhere. If you have bobcats, they're killing turkeys. If you have coyotes, they're killing turkeys, adults. If you have great horned owls, they are taking adults. If you have golden eagles, they're killing adults. As you start talking about nest and poults, the playing field gets much more diverse. You start, all of what I just mentioned will kill young turkeys, but you suddenly open yourself up to a lot of your smaller mammals, raccoons, opossums, skunks that will consume eggs, rat snakes that will consume eggs and chase and kill poults. Let's see what I'm probably forgetting some. The list is long. We don't see a lot of issues with, I get this question quite a bit, at least in the South, with fire ants and questions like that. We don't see issues with nest or poult loss from ants. But if I had to rank kind of the big ones, what we see across our sites, nest would be snakes. Of course, death of the female is problematic for incubating females. We see raccoons as a primary nest predator. Once birds start hatching, hawks become quite problematic for young poults. Snakes are still problematic. Coyotes, bobcats, owls, the same players, if you will, are taking young birds. And then once they're adults, you kind of have several of your larger mammals, a few large birds of prey, and then of course man and woman, right? I mean,
Sure.
At least for males, we're the most efficient and effective predator of males by far. Although some of us are not sometimes. Some of us are not as efficient and effective at times.
Oh, that's good. So I guess as we're heading towards the end of our time today, I wanted to kind of talk about the future. So where are we, from your personal perspective, headed in the future for wild turkeys, the next 10, 15 plus years? Obviously, you've seen kind of those declines. We talked about historical restoration efforts to kind of the current declines now. And then hopefully in many places, we're going to start seeing some of those resurgence of turkeys. But just curious what your personal thoughts are about the data and what you've been seeing in general.
Yeah, I think, like I mentioned earlier, I think in some populations we've reached, I hope, what is the low point, and we're starting to see some improvements. I don't think we'll ever go back to where we were in the 1990s and early 2000s anywhere, with probably few exceptions. But I think we're headed towards a new normal, right? Where I hope populations are going to sustain themselves wherever they are and or increase. And as you know, I mean, you would expect to see these cyclical kind of ups and
Sure.
downs through time. Some years are better than others, but the long-term trend hopefully is sustainability with some good years and some not so good years. That's what I think a lot of the data are showing in many populations, that we've gotten, knock on wood, to the low point and we're starting to see some improvements. I think you'll also see some places where there have not been declines that there will be. I,
Sure.
I think probably and there's already some evidence of this in some areas where things looked really good 3 or 4 years ago, and now suddenly you start talking to people and you start looking at some of the data sets that are being collected, and you realize this population is now starting to decline as well, and maybe had not been a few years ago. So I think you're just going to continue to see these changes in populations spatially, depending on where you're located. And I do think, and I haven't mentioned this already, but as you know, there's more research on turkeys going on now than there has been in 30
Sure.
years.
Sure.
And I think that speaks volumes about, one, people see a problem, and two, agencies are willing to spend the resources necessary to figure out why. And that gives me hope that collectively we're going to all have this information available to us in ways that would not have been possible, say, a decade ago with the advent of some of the technology that we now have. And therefore, agencies are going to have information available to them that will improve their ability to make decisions. And also, the types of activities that you're doing, that where you're trying to work with private landowners, understanding that most turkeys live on private land everywhere. The future of this bird and many other walleye species is going to rest on the shoulders of private landowners that are willing to prioritize this bird in some way moving forward. And if they are, then the future looks good for having turkeys. And if they're not, then we're going to continue to see declines in many areas.
Yeah, I think the bringing the landowners into the conversation is a great point, because here in Nebraska, I mean, we're 90+% privately owned, so we can't have a conversation about saving a species or restoration of a species without those landowners. They're such an important player.
Oh, absolutely. And it goes back to that finding the balance that we talked about earlier. And it's so critical, finding ways that we can, creative ways, innovative ways to help the producer optimize their operation so that they're able to feed and fuel the world, but at the same time ensuring the sustainability of that system for future generations. So
Absolutely.
yeah.
So, Mike, if someone's interested in a lot of your research or some of your past research, where can they go to find some of that data?
Yeah, so if you're interested in my work, you can go to wildturkeylab.com. That's a website that I created about 2 years ago now, and that website has archives of everything I've ever done, every article I've ever published or my students have published on turkeys is on that site. The site also includes very general summaries of what we did and what we found. So if you're not interested in reading research articles, but you want to know the take home points, it's there. All of the podcasts that I've done are linked on that website. All of the social media posts that I've made, which would be the other place you can find me, is archived on that site. I also post content every week on social media, on Instagram and Twitter. My handle is Wild Turkey Doc, just Wild Turkey DOC, one word. On Facebook, it's just my name. If you just type in Michael Chamberlain, you'll find my accounts. And each week I post content about turkeys. Some of it is very sciencey, and some of it is more just general information about turkeys and why they're cool and why you should think they're cool too. And whether it be what they eat or how they look or how they behave, and what I'm trying to do with that content is keep people thinking about turkeys outside of turkey hunting season, and to educate people about turkeys in a way that's easily digestible, that they can relate to. And so just kind of giving people the take home, right? Not getting down in the weeds too far with anything. And so that would be two ways of seeing content. If you ever wanted to contact me, if you just go to the University of Georgia's webpage and type in my name, you can find my email address. I'm very responsive to email. I try to be responsive to messages on Facebook and Instagram, but those get a bit overwhelming. So I'm not as good at being able to respond to those messages as I am emails.
That's good. Yeah, I appreciate it. And to your earlier point, I think one of the things I've really appreciated seeing on social media from you, and then of course your website, is disseminating that information, that science-backed information to the public, because it's so important in today's society, is getting that information out. Because obviously landowners are wanting that. They're wanting to improve their lands for turkeys and other wildlife. The public as a whole and others, who are just interested, as you mentioned, about this, that education piece is so key. So I definitely applaud you in doing that. I think it's a really important thing. So
absolutely. And then when all of this research wraps up, I think we're going to have you back on to see what we learned across the turkey range. So
we are learning some pretty wild things right now. The advent of GPS telemetry, the development of genetic markers, the development of sound recording devices, and just all of the things that have changed over the past decade have really opened my eyes to what this bird actually is. This bird functions in ways that we just didn't comprehend previously. I mean, every week we see something data-wise that causes me to just go, wait a minute, what? Like, what is that, right? And so I think the next 5 years, with no disrespect to anyone that came before me, but the next 5 years, some of what's written about this bird will change a lot of how we think about turkeys, because their populations are just they're much more complex than we thought. The way they mate, the way that they space themselves, the way that they look at related birds in flocks, the way they travel is very, very complex. And I'm excited about what the next few years will hold, because I see the data, and I'm getting the emails, and I'm seeing the spreadsheets, and I'm writing notes, and I'm talking to students and postdocs and colleagues, and we can't get it out fast enough, right? You want to get it out tomorrow, but science takes time. And as you know, and the next few years will be really cool. I'm excited.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Well, and that's a good problem to have. It's better to have a lot of data to eventually get out than not much going on. So, no, thank you again. We greatly appreciate your time and just your expertise. I think this is going to be an exciting episode for our listeners. So.
Yeah. Thanks again, Mike. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Glad to join you.
All right.
And listeners, please, if you have any topics, please shoot them our way, and we'll look forward to those.
All right. Sounds great. We'll see everybody next time.
Thanks for listening, guys. Wild Ag is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network. If you enjoy this podcast, please leave us a review so others can find us and tune in.
And we want to hear from you. You can submit questions or topic suggestions to us at wildagpodcast@gmail.com. That's WILDAG podcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.